Hi, everyone. We're back again. It's Wednesday. Welcome back to the Profit Podcast. And my name is Paul Campy. I'm one of your hosts, and I'm joined by my co-host, Matt Robinson. How's things, bud?
Very good, mate. You threw me off then when you said it's Wednesday.
Yeah, well, I thought it is Wednesday when episodes go out, but for people who don't know, we record on a Friday, so we always make sure we're recording on a Friday, but the episodes go out Wednesday. So yeah, for the listeners, it's Wednesday. Welcome everybody to another episode, and we are going to start getting into some guest episodes again soon. Matt and I have been looking at that and lining up some good guests for you all, but today it's another one with us two discussing a topic that just before we hit record, we said it could be a bit of a mishmash today, but we think it's relevant because it's been coming up quite a lot in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And when things come up a lot, we like to have a chat about them, don't we?
Yeah. We mentioned that this is a topic we've discussed in a few episodes in a roundabout way, and then you'd mentioned it had come up in a few mentee conversations and things like that.
Yeah.
So we just thought we have already covered this topic before. We are going to talk about values, but we're going to do it in a slightly different way. The last time Paul discussed it, it was all about uncovering your values and a values workshop type thing. But today, we're just going to talk about a few different things that maybe people don't often think about when it comes to values and how those maybe change over time and things like that, wasn't it, Paul?
Yeah. So you might find that our chain of conversation today goes a bit left, right, up and down in circles, whatever. But I think there'll be valuable stuff in there for people to take. And yeah, to give it context, I think the last time I did an episode on this, it was about the kind of practical steps of uncovering your values, and we will recap on them a little bit today. But the conversations I've had with people recently have been more about, do values change as you get older? Because sometimes I forget, and I'm a bit older than Matt, but I started PT when I was 20. And as I've gone up to, say, 30 to 40, the way you look at things definitely changes. And I sometimes forget as well that not all new PTs are 20. Like a lot of them will be coming into this as maybe a change of career. So even if you're a fairly new PT, first couple of years, you might be a bit later in your life. And I think that changes the way the values show up. I don't necessarily think it changes the values themselves, but maybe how you represent them and how they align with you. So those were a couple of mentor sessions I had this week where people were questioning, am I still doing the same behaviors as I was 5 years ago? And do I need to change that? So I wanted to talk a little bit more around that.
Yeah. This is because I'm same as you, Paul. I started when I was 21. So,
Yeah.
and then as I've moved into my 30s, you got family, kids, things like that. Values do change. And like you said, I think more than ever, so more than I've ever noticed, people are coming into PT at a later age. I actually find now a lot of the conversations I've had recently with people
True.
that want to discuss mentorship and stuff like that, it's not uncommon now for people to turn to PT as a career at like 40s and 50s. Like that's not uncommon anymore. And
Yeah.
people are using it quite often to get away from like a corporate job where they have a boss that's never off the back. They might earn good money, but now they want to be their own boss and they've got a passion for fitness. So not necessarily driven by finance anymore, which again will probably link back into the values. So again, it's just people are building a different type of career with fitness now, where they can, and using it more as a freedom tool, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So, first of all, maybe a good place to start then is, which is not the first bit of notes on our list, might be just to really quickly recap on the practical steps to uncovering values. Because if people are listening to this and have never done it before, first of all, go back to that episode and cover your values and use that as a play-by-play. But as a quick recap, the way that we help people do this is pick out your top 10 words that represent who you want to be in the world. Values are things that you want to stand for. And sometimes an easier way to think about that is something you want to stand against. So for example, if you hate lying, you probably really stand for honesty. Or if you hate people who are disloyal, you probably really stand for loyalty. So it's a good way of uncovering your values. So picking top 10 things that really represent you in the world. Then try and get that down to your top 3 to 5, like really narrow it down to the ones that represent you. And sometimes these come in kind of batches of words. And, we mentioned, I think on a previous episode, loyalty, integrity, and honesty. They're kind of the same thing, but they might mean different things to different people, or you might be able to group them and batch them a little bit. I'm whizzing through this. So I'll finish off with, once you've got your top 3 to 5, then we do something called define it. So really think about what that means to you. Then refine it. Refining it is, what does it look like when it's not going well? Because that's a really important step to be able to recognize, why do I feel like shit right now? And 10 times out of 10, it's because you're not behaving in line with your values. So that's a really important step, to be able to recognize it. And then align means, what do I need to change? What do I need to start doing, stop doing, or continue doing to make sure that I'm living my values day to day? Because the more days you have like that, the happier you're going to be. Bottom line.
Yep. So if you've not done that Paul sort of discussed there, then that's definitely step 1, isn't it? Go away and figure that out. I do believe that, like many things that we do, these things are often sold on the premise that it's like a one and done. I think this is something that takes a good bit of looking at. So start the process, come up with like an initial list, then maybe take some time away from it, like come back to it in a few days or a few weeks time and look again. And I know that it took me maybe a couple of years before I actually felt that I had a 3 to 5 values that felt right and that I'd come up with a bit of a definition for, that I can look back on and clearly measure whether or not if I'm in alignment with those things.
Well, I'm going to throw a question at you here then. Do you think in your 20s you knew what they were?
No.
Early 20s?
No, I don't. Yeah. Or if I did, I think they were probably based on what I thought they should be.
Right.
As opposed to what they were.
Right.
It's easy, isn't it, to sort of, put things down that you think the world expects of you, or that you think are going to make you happy or whatever. But sometimes you've not really figured, like especially in your 20s, you've not really figured out what makes you happy.
Yeah.
At that sort of age, Yeah.
I
mean, it might be 4 Jaeger bombs on a Friday night and that's you done, but that's not it's not real happiness. So
can't do that. That would make me very unhappy these days. But yeah, exactly. And maybe we need to say that this is no judgment at all on when you're in your early 20s trying to figure out who you are. A lot of the things I think I tripped over. I don't think I knew. I wasn't consciously thinking my values are correct or anything like that. And you are searching for a lot of things. So if you're 20 odd listening to this, don't feel like you have to have it all nailed down, is something I'd say.
Yeah. And even if you have got clarity on some of them, they might just change in terms of like order of importance, might they? Like, I've always known that family is important to me.
Yeah.
But before I had a family, it wasn't my number 1 priority.
Right.
It wasn't top of the tree, because it was like, well, yeah, I've got a girlfriend that I've been with for a while. We're engaged, whatever, not yet married, but I've not got my own family. I've got a family, but my business actually comes first at the moment, and building that and pushing that forwards. And it was much more about growth and things like that. Whereas now those values still feature, but they're in a different order.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that, if you are, say, and maybe this is how we discuss this today, is kind of going through 20s, 30s, 40s. And this is not generic for everybody, but it's just pointing out, you might be a PT in your 30s now, listening to role models that are in their 20s and thinking, how do I get to that? Without actually thinking, do I need to get to that? Is that something that really aligns with me right now and aligns with my values? Or do I need to look at that and find, and you've said this in the past about education, find the role models that are right for you at the time. Like when you're in your 20s, it might be that those people are the right people for you to follow, because that fits with who you are and what you're driving towards. But be prepared for that to change as time goes on, because you will prioritize different stuff. You just will. when you used to laugh at your parents saying, let's go for a walk in the country, and you were like, what the hell are we doing this for? God's honest truth, you will start to think that's an amazing idea. You really will. and that's okay. Like, it just happens. You start to reconnect with things that you just didn't think were important.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that changes, as I mentioned, that order potentially changing over time, I have noticed that the definition of the values changes. If the value, I think one of the notes I sent to you was that I don't think that the underlying values change much. I think you can get a bit of a grasp of what's important to you, and you might choose a different word to describe it, maybe something that resonates with you more than another thing, but the underlying values maybe stay the same, but just how you define them and maybe how you measure them, and that probably, I think, is what's more important. I think a great example of that is something like a value like freedom. I think there can be such a variation in how one person views freedom compared to someone else, and what that might look like and how that's defined. And you might hear someone talk about freedom and you might think to yourself, I don't want any of that, but I do want freedom, but not that version of it. And you've got to then come up with like your own. And it doesn't mean you have to change the word. You can just define it in a different way or whatever. So again, don't feel like you're having to stay within these boxes of what you think a word means. You get to define what these values are in your own way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Coming back to those steps, it is really important to go for the right words for you, the right definition for you. And then based on where you're at in your life and where you're at in your career, how do you want to align with that? How do you want to align with that right now? Which could be very, very different to earlier on in your career. If you're working 13, 14-hour days, 15 years later, you might find that I don't want to do that anymore. But I think some of the things that have come up, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this as well. Some of the things that have come up in the conversations I've had is someone who does have a value of, say, hard work, which is one of mine, which, using myself and probably someone I've spoken to this week as an example, is that I used to feel like hard work, I had to be aligned with long, hard days, 12, 13 hours, putting the effort in, putting the time in, getting the short end of the stick sometimes, looking for the long-term reward, delayed gratification, all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure that's the same way I'd represent that today. I think I'd look more to hard work at the right times and hard work in different areas of my life rather than it just being work related. So that might give people a bit of an idea, a bit of an example of how things might change. It's not the value that's changed, but how you demonstrate it definitely will.
Yeah. And if you think, like, if you actually boil that down, it makes a lot of sense, because if you're going to work hard the same way now as you did 15 years ago, then you've not learned anything, have you? Like, most of the hard work you do in your 20s is probably on the wrong things in the wrong way. You've not actually developed any of the skills or the experience to be better at those things. So working hard at a later age is going to be, or should be, especially if it's in a field you know well, it should be less hard work than it was before, because you know so much more, and you know where you can sort of, if you relate it to something like the 80-20 rule or something, you know the 20% that you can work on to get the 80% of the results and move the needle in that way. You might not have to do something on all of it to get a big result.
Yeah. Do you think there might be, and again, this is probably more of a question to myself, sometimes there's a bit of an attachment to the old way you did it and seeing it as a failure if you don't still do it that way. Just thinking of, there was a definite adjustment period to, not being in that work environment nonstop, then to having a family, not being able to do the 10, 11, 12-hour work days, feeling like that was wrong or in some way I was failing. And that took a bit of adjustment just from a personal point of view. So there might be, if you're out there listening to this and thinking that you've got to lose that attachment sometimes to the behavior. And the title of this podcast was about revisiting values to drive positive behaviors. And sometimes you can associate like that's a bad behavior. And I probably did that myself, that I'm not working hard enough. Whereas you are, it's just that there's other things now that are in your life that you need to represent in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully without confusing things. I think that's where you start to touch a little bit on like identity as well. You've got an identity that you're trying to withhold. And it's like, because I value hard work, I try and, you know, embody hard work. And this is how I embody hard work. And like you say, over time, that does change. And I think something as well we have to be careful of is there are people in the world that we look at and we hold on a pedestal. Let's pick someone like Elon Musk, for example. You know, let's be honest, that guy's not normal. He's on another planet in terms of how he sees the world and how he does things. And
I was just going to say he's like an alien.
Yeah,
He is like an alien. Yeah.
That guy thinks it's absolutely fine to have like loads of kids and allocate 2 hours a week to spending time with them. Like that just doesn't make sense in my world. It's a different world that he's actually living
it's
in.
Viewed through a different lens. That's the point. Yeah.
Whole different reality. So again, sometimes you've got to be careful about, well, that's how he works hard. Well, yeah, that's fine. It's not how you work hard. You work hard in a different way and you work hard on different things. You work hard at being a parent as well as being a business owner. It's understanding how that value relates to the actual different parts of your life as well, because the hard work value that you might have had in your 20s probably only related to work, whereas now it probably spills over into other areas as well, like work hard on being a great dad, work hard on being a great husband. And I think it does filter into those different areas. And yeah, like you say, it can become too attached to that identity as well that often goes with that value.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there as well. And without generalizing too much, you probably are in your 20s thinking more about your career. You probably are. You probably are thinking more about your image, how you look, how people perceive you. You probably are trying to attract a significant other in some way, shape, or form. And then as you hit your 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, your priorities do change. And be prepared to be flexible with that and be prepared to probably have a bit of pain with that. There's a bit of almost bit of adjustment and a like I said, that feeling of maybe I'm failing. That might be quite normal. And I wanted to put that message out there to some people because I've heard this a couple of times in the last 2 or 3 months of people saying I feel a bit lost. And sometimes that translates as I don't really feel like I've got a direction. And they've never really readjusted the compass. They've never gone back to their values and gone, am I pointing in the right direction? And it might be that just needs to be revisited, just needs to be checked in with again. What's changed? You know, has your relationship situation changed? Do you have kids now? What point are you in your life? What's important to you now? How do you represent that? And maybe they just need a bit of adjustment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's difficult to make that adjustment if you don't know what values are important to you, because especially with something like a word like direction, you've probably got very few things to measure that by or sort of score that by, other than like, am I earning more money? Am I doing bigger things? So if you've got no values attached to it, what are you measuring that direction against? Because, you know, one of my values is growth, but growth doesn't always mean more of everything. It's the right things. Do you know what I mean? It's growth in the right way, and finding ways to grow. There is a financial component to that, but again, it's got to be within a certain way of growing that doesn't impede on other things. And you've just got to be careful when you start saying to yourself these things like, "Oh, I'm lacking direction," and that. Well, what does direction mean?
Definitely.
What is that? What does that mean to you? How are you actually thinking about that? Even if it's subconsciously, you might not have asked yourself that before. What does it mean? What would that a good direction be for you? If you've not got a clue, then there's no values attached to it.
Definitely. And if I'm speaking to a very specific person here, if you're somebody who's maybe new to the industry for a couple of years, got stuck in, set yourself targets, got to 5, 6, 7 grand a month income from your business, and all of a sudden there's no more targets because you're successful. Like on paper, you've done it. Like you got to where you thought, this is great. I've kind of got enough. And there's so many people get to that point and go, well, I don't really know what to do now. So that's really sometimes a really good time to revisit your values and think, what did I want to create from this? Not that that first couple of years was bad. I really want to emphasize that as well, is that targets and direct that initial really focused black and white direction, I think is important. I
Yeah.
think sometimes you need that to keep it simple. Like we talk about this all the time, especially around nutrition. You get a client in, you've got to try and keep it simple. You've got to try and say, this is going to be, I'm going to take care of all the jargon behind the scenes. All I want you to do is A, B, and C. And then they can move in the right direction and get momentum. But I think there is a bit of a natural phase where you hit those targets and then you go, oh, okay, I need to check in with this, because where do I go now? Like 10 grand, 15 grand, 20 grand? What for?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think that's where this becomes most important, actually, is because this can hit you hardest when you're actually doing well and you're
Doing well. Yeah.
doing a good, and you're doing an actual good job. But especially from a PT perspective, there does reach a point where when you've been doing it long enough and you sort of look around and you think to yourself, I can pick clients up fairly easily now. I can get results with people. That's not as challenging as it once was. People stick around. They don't leave. Like most of the things that need to be done get done just as part of my day-to-day habits and routines. And it does start to, although everything is going really well and you're doing a good job, like I think that's the important part to remember, is you're actually doing a good job. You can still feel like where from here. And I reckon that translates to not just PT, but any business. I imagine that translates across anything that anyone does, and does to a good standard over a period of time. So yeah, just revisiting and going again and sort of thinking, right, I need to take a step back here to then be able to take some steps forwards.
Yeah, definitely. And you've mentioned something in the past that would help people here. Sometimes when you are in that bit of a muddle, go and do some education, go and do some learning. You've always said best thing in that position is go and do a course. You never know. And quite often, when you do get a little bit further into your career, say you're in your 30s or your 40s, you almost want, and I don't know whether this is a natural thing, you almost want this assurance that if I put X in, I'm going to get Y back. This transactional assurance. Whereas when I was in my 20s doing courses, I just went. Like I didn't even know what I was going to get. And you just kind of trust that if I throw myself into this, I'm sure I'll get something. Whereas when you get older, you go, right, if I spend X, what's my return? And you might need to kind of go back to that bit of freedom, like that word you used at the start, bit of freedom, and go, do you know what? I'm just going to go and do this course. I'm going to go meet some new people. I'm going to have some fun. I'm sure I'll learn some shit. And maybe it'll throw up a few things that I didn't expect. And that'll get my excitement going again. Or the variety. I think there's a bit of that. Get stuck in again.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when we used to go on courses and stuff, it was like going on a weekend away with your mates, weren't it? It was like,
Yeah, I had no idea sometimes what to expect. I wasn't thinking this is going to make me X amount of pounds off the other end. And some courses made me absolutely jack all. It was kind of the opposite. It maybe gave me some learning in a different way, but you're more willing to take a risk. And I think maybe if you're a PT now listening in your 30s, 40s, 50s, there's definitely that risk aversion that you go, well, it has to be, if I put 3 grand in, I want to see a 30 grand return. It's not always about that. It's better to go, what's my values? If one of your values is growth, like Matt's just said, then go and grow, go and learn, go and grow, go and meet some new people, go and learn some new information. That's 3 grand well spent.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's in line.
What always struck me as well, Paul, when we went on as many courses, because we back in the day, we were going on loads, weren't we? And I was always amazed. Yeah. And now I don't know whether you would see the same, because obviously a lot of it's done more online, but we turn up to a course and quite often you were sat next to someone whose course you were set to take in like a few weeks' time, and you sort of looking around thinking, I thought this guy was like the top of the game, and like that's the point, and they're still they're still throwing themselves into
That's
Like
right.
I remember being at one or two courses and like meeting what would now be considered like influencers. You know, back then that wasn't a thing, but now they'd be considered, you know, big influencers. And you're like, oh shit, like they're in the audience, they're on this course, like
Yeah.
we are. Like what are they doing here?
Yeah. Never
And it's
stop
just
learning.
and
Yeah.
you just that was massive for me. You sort of thought, right, that was a big light bulb. Like if that type of person's here, then I've got a lot to do. So yeah.
Yeah. And again, revisiting the values will help you with that, because it might help you see, like, okay, that is actually in line with who I am. That is my compass. It makes me happy. Then go and do it. Don't think about the transaction. Just go and do it. And that might be similar with some of the other values as well. It might be a case of going, actually, at my core, this is who I am. And if I think about it, really, I just need to go and do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Something I thought that might be worth bringing up today, Paul, that I'd popped down in the notes was what to do if you're struggling to uncover your values. So if you've had a go at this before and maybe not quite settled on something, or if you're looking at this for the first time, I think there's a few different ways you can look at this to try and
Yeah.
uncover these over time. So I think one thing you can do is look back at some of your recent behaviors and things that you found yourself wanting to do more of, and maybe seeing what that reveals. So let's say, for example, you recently went and picked up a sport again or something like that and found yourself wanting to re-engage in that sport. What might that tell you about your values? Is there something in there that might get you thinking about, well, actually, you like being part of a team, or is competition part of your makeup? Or again, does it come back to like hard work? Is it working hard on something in a different way? Look at some of the
Yeah.
things you've done recently that really stand out to you and see what that might reveal about your inner workings and your values. And I think you can do a similar thing with any recent like trips or experiences that you've had. Like if you've been away somewhere and you did something while you were there, or you just spent some good time with family. Like what does that tell you when you come back and sort
Definitely.
of when you unpick why you enjoyed that experience? What is it about the experience you actually enjoyed? Because I can guarantee it's not the slap up meal or the amazing location, or it's probably something else that you were doing while you were in those places at that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It
Yeah.
might be the conversations you were having. It might be the company that you were with. There's lots of different things that I think you can just look back on and go, these are things that stand out to me as being stuff that comes up repeatedly. How might that translate into a value that I probably hold?
Yeah. Perfect example of that teamwork one with sport. It might not be the actual sport. It might be just
Yeah.
lacking team. Like team is something you love and you haven't got it, and you want to get it somewhere else. And that can then in turn really have a knock-on effect into, if you're then doing team stuff in your personal life, you might find that in your work life, you're quite satisfied, or you're much more satisfied, you're much happier because you're getting that stimulus somewhere else. You're getting that connection somewhere else. So you don't have to have as much in your work life. So you might just get it from somewhere different, or it might inspire you to do more of it in your work life. So each one in every area will have a knock-on effect as well. So yeah, definitely deconstructing what you love to do is a good way to see it.
And then I think an actual practical application of your values, once you've uncovered them, that then helps you avoid some of the stuff that Paul mentioned right at the start, where people are feeling lost and off track and things like that. Just be very aware that I think this probably applies more to when you're struggling to make a decision on something. Sometimes we've got decisions to make and it's quite clear and obvious what decision we need to make.
Right.
But I often think to myself, and I often speak to others, that when you've got a decision to make and you're sort of mulling it over a bit and you're struggling a bit with it, you're sort of churning it around, even if it's a small decision, run it through what I like to call a values test. Just run it against your values and see if it becomes clearer and more obvious what decision to make. Most of the time it does. And then it just becomes a simple game of, we'll make the decisions that are in alignment with your values, and you won't find yourself straying too far away from them. I
Yeah.
know that sounds overly simplistic, but I do think it can be that simple at times. People just
Yeah.
make poor decisions based on ignoring what's important to them.
No, Well, yeah, it does sound simple, but it is that is it. I think that's the core of it. Is it allows you then to have a good no strategy and a good yes strategy. So when somebody offers you something, and similar to the client I was speaking to this week, really, is that this is a successful person who gets a lot of opportunities, and it's knowing what to say yes to and what to say no to, as opposed to going, oh, I feel like I should do that. I'm going to miss out. It doesn't matter. It's what's going to make you happy. And that's the best thing to pursue. You know, that's always the best thing to pursue. So running it through that values filter, I like that. Give you an idea of, actually, it feels terrible. I shouldn't do it. Well, turn it down then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Not as messy as I thought that.
No, we've done all right there, haven't we? It's not a I think where things feel messy to us is if there's not like a part 1, part 2, or step 1, step 2. We often break things down like that, don't we? But that just was never going to work today.
No, I don't think so. Don't worry, we'll be back to that format, no doubt, because that's part of who we are. But I think that the subject today was more about, if you're in the new year, maybe you're a PT who's been at it a few years, because we do have a lot of listeners like that, and we do have people who are maybe later in their life when they start PT, and sometimes listening to that, the role models or the PTs that are in their 20s smashing a business 15 hours a day is not the right person to be listening to, and the best person to listen to is often yourself. So redo your values, reevaluate it, and see what comes out.
Yep.
Okay. Right. I think that's it for today's episode. I hope that helps. As always, any questions, reach out to Matt and myself. And other than that, have a great week. We will see you Friday for us. We'll see you next Wednesday.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.